Well, good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Often I'm asked, of all our work in the Coming Home Network, and we're working with many non-Catholic Christians that come home to the church, I'm often asked, what's the biggest which group do they come from, the biggest group? And invariably, the usual suspects are the Episcopalians and Anglicans. They make more sense coming home to the Catholic. Maybe the Lutherans. Well, the truth is, yes, number one group of folk that come back to the Catholic Church are the Anglicans, Episcopalians. But the second biggest group are the Baptists. What are they doing coming home to the Catholic Church or discovering the Catholic Church? Anyway, I use that as an introduction because our guest tonight, Allison Dreher, is a former Baptist. In fact, she's a former PK. We'll find out about that in a moment. She's also the Director of Evangelization and Catechesis for Mater Dolorosa Parish. And Allison, what a great privilege to
Thank you.
Have you on the Journey Home program.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
And you've got a lot of things. I know you, besides being a PK, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but also you did some work with, you still do some work with the UN.
I do.
And we'll talk about that. And then your new involvement with, I think it's really involved with Mystagogia.
So RCIA, PSR, Parish School of Religion, all of the above, youth ministry.
Well, that's exciting. That's exciting. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let me shut my mouth and invite you to start us on the journey, if you would.
Sure. So my father is a Baptist minister, and my first memories are of church. But we were in Las Vegas when I was little, and I first became a Christian at the age of 5 in Sin City. And our church was First Southern Baptist in Las Vegas, right off the Strip. And I remember laying in the car, seeing the Hilton sign, and all the lights from the Strip, and just knowing, not feeling. As a little child, you don't really know about those kinds of things, but heard a simple gospel message, about, Jesus, yes, you died on the cross for your sins, yes, and I knew all of those things, and then the pastor says, have you ever personally accepted that? And at 5, I was like, well, no. And he said, do you want to? And I said, well, yeah, and so it was a very simple, childlike faith, walked down the aisle, took the pastor by the hand, and got baptized, at 5 years old. And then always, knew that part of the Christian life was, obedience and continuing to grow. That was always something that was, taught to me. And so as I grew older, I really struggled with that initial decision. Went through, teenage years, 12, 11, 13, and really thought, is there any way that I could have known what I was doing when I was 5 years old?
Allison, I don't mean to, I'm on pause here because it fascinates me when I think about the emphasis of your Baptist church. They saw the importance of a person making a decision, a choice, intellectual, willful choice of Jesus.
Right.
And we end up having these two extremes, that in churches like the Catholic Church or High Anglican or High Lutheran, we can end up leaning towards the externals. So as long as you've gone through baptism and confirmation and catechesis and you go to Mass, that's fine. And sometimes there's no emphasis on making a choice.
Right.
Where the other extreme is once you've made the choice, you've arrived.
You've arrived.
You have these two extremes.
Yes.
We need to come together. The sacraments are absolutely important, but so is the choice.
Right. So,
But you're saying that choice you made, you're wondering, well,
was it real? As I got older, I was always very precocious and intellectual, and I thought there's just no way that I could have known what God was going to ask me to do, and there's no way that was real. And so when I was 12 or 13 years old, I did it again. And I went down and I was like, I'm 12. I know some things about life, and I know what God's going to ask me to do, or at least to some degree. I know the kind of life that I'm saying yes to now. And so I didn't rededicate my life because I'd convinced myself that what happened when I was 5.
And you weren't rebaptized.
I was rebaptized.
Oh, you were? Okay.
I was.
Because baptism was just a sign of that decision.
But for me it was an obedience issue, because if what happened when I was 5 wasn't real, then the first act of obedience is baptism. And I was kind of embarrassed because my dad was a minister, and here I am 12, 13 years old, and I should have made that decision a long time ago, but I swallowed my pride, and I said the first step of a Christian is baptism, and if this is the real one, then I need to do it. And so I got rebaptized. A funny story is that, fast forward, when I was getting married, we needed, proof of my baptism. And so I called the original church, First Southern, and they couldn't find my baptismal record, but the one that was found was the one that was when I was 12. And so that's the one that I have in my file as, so I don't know, is that what?
That's funny. I mean, I suppose from a Catholic standpoint, it was the first one that really mattered.
Right.
But
the one I have a record.
There's no record of it.
That's right. And so, so you fast forward, through my teenage years, that whole lordship issue, kept coming up over and over again. Who is Lord and Master of your life? And so my dad and I had, very long conversations about, when push comes to shove, when my will rears up and hits against God's will, who wins? And so I always wanted for God to win, because I wanted to do what he wanted me to do. I remember being 14, 15 years old with my concordance, studying the Greek and the Hebrew about the will of God, and I wanted to make these Bible studies to teach other people. I've always known that I was going to be a teacher. There is this retreat center in New Mexico called Glorieta, and it's my happy place. And there is this beautiful prayer garden with a stone amphitheater. And in the evangelical world, women aren't allowed to be preachers. So I would be alone in this stone amphitheater, and I would get behind the pulpit and I would preach to those rocks. And the scripture that says, the rocks themselves will cry out if we don't. I was like, the rocks are not going to cry out in my place. Let me tell you about Jesus, tell you about God and what he's asking, how much he loves us. So I have.
And he can make children of Abraham of these rocks.
That's right. That's right. So, so I always knew that I was supposed to teach, and that's something I always knew. So by the time I got to be like a junior in high school, I had a very serious relationship with a boy that was not a healthy relationship. Several things in my life, just social anxieties, body image issues. I was in gymnastics. I wasn't a great gymnast, but I still competed, and I didn't have the right body type for that, and I think just emotional difficulties. And I had this boyfriend. It was not a good relationship. And he ended up, cheating on me with some other girls. And, purity was a huge thing for me. And I had made the Promise Keepers thing, that whole purity ring thing. I had already made that choice to wait until marriage for intimacy. And so that was something that my boyfriend didn't want. And so we broke up. Long story short, we broke up. It was crushing to me, because for me, it was that I wasn't beautiful enough to keep and to captivate somebody for a lifetime, and so I took all of that emotional energy out into my physical appearance, and sort of started to self-destruct. That I'm not beautiful. I know I was smart, but all of these things were because I was fat or because I wasn't beautiful. And some of the promises of God, that, he who keeps his mind on God will experience the peace that passes all understanding. I didn't have that peace. Some of those key scriptures about, if you follow after the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, all of these promises, I just didn't experience that peace. Yeah. And so I just, either God was a liar or I was just messed up. And I knew better than God was a liar. And so I was just messed up. And so I took all of that emotional pain and I put it and directed it at myself. And that relationship that I had in high school was kind of like the final straw for me. And so I made a vow, that I was just going to fix what God sort of messed up. And I started to have an eating disorder. And that was right before my senior year of high school. I was able to hide it. I lost a lot of weight. My parents, they say looking back that they really underreacted during that time. They wish if they could have gone back that they would have really known what was going on, but they had no experience. I mean, we kind of rocked along. Our family was, we're a strong family. We knew we were loved, all of those things. The risk factors for eating disorders, I wasn't in that category really. Yeah. My dad, I had, my mom, I knew they loved me, but yet here I was. And so when I was in college, it got really, really bad. And I was 89 pounds And
Really? Wow.
yeah, it was not a good place. And so I remember in February of the spring semester, I called my dad and I was like, Daddy, I'm dying. I need you to come get me. And now he knew that I wasn't in a good place, but I don't know if you've ever been around anybody with an addiction. When they're not ready to be helped, they're not going to get helped.
Yeah.
I had to ask for the help. And so, yeah.
I'm just wondering, so, boy, a couple things hit me about this, because one, it really points to the danger, dark side of sola scriptura.
Yeah.
Because you can pull a verse out, and unless you have good guidance, there are verses there that are scary.
Yeah.
And that's what it sounds like you're saying. You're looking at, I should have this peace and I'm not having it. What's wrong?
Yeah, what's wrong with me?
What's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe maybe you can need some spiritual direction on those verses to help understand that, Martin Luther needed that too. I mean, he was so down on himself, he created a new religion, if you will.
Yeah.
So you need that spiritual direction. And I'm also wondering I don't understand eating disorders, so I'm not going to pretend. But when you look at yourself in the mirror, did you always see yourself unbeautiful?
I did. Yeah.
No matter what you saw there.
Yes. It was kind of a body dysmorphia kind of thing. I would literally see things that just weren't there, and truly believed that that's what was there. And no matter what anybody around me would say, I would just, you have to say that because, you have to say I'm beautiful because you're my mom. You'd be a bad mom if you said I was ugly. And so during this time, I was a cheerleader and I did, tumbling and things. But before I got sick, this was right, in the time with that bad relationship, I was doing something in front of a crowd, and a whole group of guys in the crowd started mooing at me and telling me that I was a cow and that I was so white that I needed to tan. And I stood there and I just thought, these boys are telling me the truth about who I am. They have no reason to lie to me. And here they are telling me the truth, right? So my friends, my family, everybody's telling me that I'm beautiful, but they have to, or they're bad people. Here are these boys, this is the truth about me. And it changed me that night. It was a very poignant moment in my life. And I walked away from that just like, okay, see, I'm right.
Wow. Our guest is Allison Dreher. What a vicious spiral downward. What a vicious spiral downward. And as you said, when we have people in our life that are in some kind of a spiral downward, how do you pray for them, you love them, but if they're, no matter what you say, if they've got an answer inside that says you're wrong,
Well, it's even kind of like the cultural idea that, what I say, my truth, right? I hear what you're saying, but my truth says, I know I'm right. I know I'm right about myself. You are wrong. And when I started recovery, I read this book one time and I remember it dawned on me. But the question was, is it possible that you might be wrong about yourself? And I had never considered that before. And intellectually, I had to think, it is possible that I'm wrong. It's not likely, but it's possible. And so that was a little bitty crack in the door that if it's possible that I'm wrong about myself. And when I accepted that possibility, God really used that to help in my recovery from the eating disorder. So
my favorite scripture, which I know I've mentioned far too many times on the journey home, is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And it comes to mind as you're talking there. You trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not
into your own understanding.
Mm-hmm. In all your ways point to Him, and He'll direct your path.
That's right.
That's kind of what happened to you, but it
exactly.
took you being awakened to that second line.
Yes.
Is not leaning on your own understanding.
And I knew that verse, and I knew I wasn't supposed to do that, but I don't know, I wouldn't believe the people in my life that loved me. I'm like, I know myself more than you know me. And it was that idea that if people really, really knew, if they really knew what was in my heart, they wouldn't love me anymore.
Were you saying that your parents were to some extent oblivious to what was happening in you?
I think the depth of the sadness and the emotional pain that was there, I think they were a little bit, not oblivious, because my father is actually a counselor and a very gifted counselor. And so he would the spiritual direction that you're talking about, I had all of that. I did. We would talk about it. He would counsel, women who were in very abusive relationships. And I remember, and I've seen my dad cry maybe 5 times in my life, and 4 of them were because of something I did. And I remember he was in my bedroom one night, and it was during this relationship with this boy that was very unhealthy. And he said, I counsel women who are in these relationships and they can't get out. And he said, and it terrifies me to see the same thing in you. And he cried, and I was like, Daddy, don't cry, and but there's just, I don't.
Was this also connected with you being a PK?
My dad and my parents never put that.
I mean, the point that you wouldn't be as open to hearing him.
No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
As far as like I'm my own worst enemy. My parents never put on me this standard of perfection, but as a PK, you do live in a fishbowl, and I'm sure. And I was held to a different standard than other children. When I was little, I remember folding something in church, and it was making kind of a loud noise. And one of the ministers he was the minister to the deaf, and he was signing, and I knew it was loud, and I was like. And so after church, he kind of pushed me up against a wall, and he was like, "You are a bad," and just said some really terrible things that just made me like, I was like, I should probably get in the car because my parents are going to leave me at church because I'm a bad little girl. Now, my dad found out about that he did that, and he pushed him up against a wall and said, I don't care if she's running around like an Indian about to, burn down the church, She said, don't ever say anything to her ever again. And so I was like, yeah, so.
This also seems to touch on a little bit of personality type, because you were very sensitive.
Yes.
Another person may not have responded, even to the boys making fun.
Yes.
You could have blown it off.
Yes.
But you aren't going to blow it off.
No, very sensitive, yes. Highly feelings to the nth. Different people experience feelings and emotions different levels, and I've always been a very deep feeler.
Is that a common factor leading to eating disorders, you think?
Well, an eating disorder is more about an addiction than it is about, it is about emotions, but all addictions come from the same place. It's maladaptive ways of dealing with, emotions in life. And so I just picked food. I could have picked any number of things. So, yeah.
Wow. So how long did this...
So when I called my dad and he came down to college, I went into a treatment facility. It was an inpatient treatment facility in Arizona, and I stayed there for a few months. I came home, and it was the summertime at this point, and I moved back home with my parents, started college again, and this is when I met my husband. So I had just got back from this, and I was at a healthier weight. I was still very brittle, but I met my husband. And about 6 months later, we started dating. And I was kind of boy crazy, like very boy crazy. And every boy was a potential boyfriend for me. And so he was just another, very nice looking, nice guy, paid attention to me. So I went out with him a few times. But after a few weeks, I realized it was getting kind of serious. And I thought, we got to talk about God. Where are you with all of that? And I found out he was Catholic, and I was like, oh, that's a problem. Let me introduce you to my dad, come to my church, get you saved, get you to stop worshiping Mary, get you on the right track.
The typical anti-Catholic myth.
Yes,
right, okay.
Yes. And so he did that. But he was, very gracious, and he said, if I'm going to come to church with you, then you should come to church with me. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, great, I'll absolutely do that. And I saw it as an evangelism opportunity. Like, not only am I going to help this guy, I can also help the priest and the whole Catholic Church, and I'll just, undo what Martin Luther did. And I had big plans, Marcus, big plans for the church. And I came in armed with my Bible, and I had some little pamphlet and all the scriptures about why the church was wrong. And the priest that we went to see, it was on our college campus. I was 19, and he had answers for all of my,
Well, you actually had a confrontation with him.
Yeah. No, we had a conversation.
Okay.
And I was, to me, his theology was very sloppy. His exegesis was even sloppier, and I was like, but my logic from point A to point C, A equals B equals C, therefore A equals C. He didn't see it like that. And I said, how can you be so comfortable when I'm clearly showing you the flaws in your logic? And so that got me scratching my head, how he could be so comfortable when so clearly I was, blowing holes in his theology. And so that sent us on a theological journey together. Now, during this time, I would relapse and I would go back and relapse. So my husband would come, he would come counseling with me, and I have no idea why he stayed around Marcus.
I'm sorry, relapse in your eating
Into
disorder.
my eating disorder,
Yes,
yeah. So I was
yes.
still in counseling, I would be going to school, and then I would have a month that was good, and then a month that was not good. And Jacob, my husband, he would say that, he didn't really understand why he stayed either. But what would happen was that he would go to Mass during a particular amount, a hard time. And he'd be kneeling there like, I'm at my end, I can't love her. And he would hear, just stick it out. Stick it out. You love this woman. And he would come back renewed with this new sense of purpose and desire and strength to walk with me through this time. And I'm sitting there scratching my head. I'm like, any other guy would run screaming from my crazy. I mean, it was crazy times. And so when I talk about my conversion story, it's recovery, conversion, and a love story, like all wrapped up into one. And when I taught school, my kids, my students, I taught religion and science, but in religion class, they wanted to hear about my story more than they wanted to talk about, liturgy or whatever. And so I would find ways to weave my story into what I was trying to teach them, and they were riveted. And so, so for that year or so that we dated, we both really studied. I, got a hold of Scott Hahn. Confession was so easy for me. That was one that was not a problem. And it's because when somebody who is going through an addiction recovery, they work the 12 steps, right? And one of the steps is to admit what you have done out loud to another human. And I was like, well, if the Holy Spirit is a part of that, and Jesus is a part of that, and there is true spiritual cleansing and healing, I knew the healing that came from working the step. So confession, I was like, when can I go? That was not a problem for me. The real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, not a problem for me. Purgatory was a little bit of an issue, but Mary, she was just my biggest hang up. I could not, I'm like, this is idolatry. I'm sorry. And so, a year and a half, later, I got really bad again, and I had to leave again and go into another treatment center. And my husband moved in. We were still just dating. We weren't even engaged. My husband moved into my parents' home because he was working at the Baton Rouge airport. And so it was easier for him to go from my parents' house than from where he was from. And I was only allowed to talk on the phone for like 15 minutes on a Saturday and 15 minutes on a Sunday. And he would stay there and live for those 30 minutes to be able to talk with me. And so he stuck it. I was there for about 6 months. I came home on a break for Thanksgiving, and he asked me to marry him in front of my family. It was like a Christmas thing. We were all able to, and so he proposed in front of my whole family, and I was shocked. I'm like, I'm crazy. Why do you want to marry me? And I said, all these things go through your head in just a second. And, because I knew that I have to back up a little bit. We got to the point where he said, I can't be Baptist. He really studied, he considered it. He really thought maybe the church is wrong. Maybe, her dad's saying some really very logical things that makes a lot of sense. But for him, he truly believes that, that Jesus Christ founded the church, and that Jesus will lead it and guide it in all truth. And he said, I feel much more comfortable standing before God at judgment and saying I gave you too much credit than to stand before God and be like, well, I just thought I was right. And so he was going to remain Catholic. And I remember lamenting to my father. I was like, I can't be Catholic. I can't. I've studied it. There are beautiful things that I love that I know that I would really, grow as a Christian or, but I just can't say that I believe all of that stuff. So when he asked me to marry him, I'm like, all of these things, I'm like, I'm not Catholic, you are. I'm like, what, and so as, I said yes. I was terrified that whole, once you meet the person, you just know. I was terrified. I didn't know. That's crazy. And so we were talking afterwards, and I said, Jacob, how are we going to do this thing? I mean, I can't be Catholic. And he looked at me and he said, I love you with such a pure kind of love that this issue is going to be resolved. I don't want you to become Catholic because of me. And I said, well, I know you don't, but, I didn't. But in that moment when he said how much he loved me, I believed his love more than I believed my own fear and anxiety about the thing. Oh. And I trusted him. And I said, okay, I believe you. And so my dad, he said, you're going to have to become Catholic. And I was like, I know.
Your dad was accepting, supportive?
He was. Actually, my dad and I are so close. We have a wonderful relationship. And he only ever said one thing to me. We were in the kitchen, and we have a long history of Baptist preachers. And, our family has been in the United States since the late 1700s. My great-great-great-grandfather was part of the Southern Baptist Convention in Florida. William Peterson Ketchend is his name. And so we have this tradition, and so he did say, I can't believe you're doing this to the family. And I was like, oh, Daddy, that's not fair. And he's like, you know what, babe, you're right. And I'm so sorry. Will you please forgive me? And we hugged, and now, do we have spirited debates? Yes, we do. We have very spirited debates. We talk about theology, and he, when it starts to get to where I feel uncomfortable, or, I'm like, Daddy, let's stop. I love you. I'm not going anywhere. I'm always going to be your daughter. I don't know how you do it, because, he could stand up and beat his chest and, throw down the I'm your father, and he would be right. But he never does that, ever.
Well, we're going to pause there, Allison, because what we're stopping you at is you have a husband that says how much he loves you, right?
Yeah.
But you can't become Catholic.
I can't.
Even though your dad says, okay. So there you are.
Yep.
Okay. So we'll take a break and we'll come back. What happened? The second part of the story. And I do want to remind you as we take a break of the website chnetwork.org, where you can find lots of stories like Allison's. Hers is uniquely powerful, and we'll hear the rest of it in a moment. But I do want to encourage you to check out our website. So we'll see you in a bit. All right. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Allison Dreher. So we've left you at a seemingly insurmountable barrier, if you will. But the positive thing was that you were aware of your own issues, right?
Yes.
I mean, that in itself.
Yes, very aware. Even from the very beginning, I knew, but I got the result that I wanted. I lost weight, right? So I continued to do it. Okay. So what I didn't say before the break is that when I studied Catholicism, I actually enrolled in some RCIA classes. So I went through one at a church in Baton Rouge, and nobody was there with me. I was alone. Jacob, my boyfriend at the time, nobody was around. So I just stopped going. And then I went on a second time at Christ the King, was the student center at LSU. Mm-hmm. And so I went through that a little bit too, but again, I stopped. And I think I relapsed during that time too, into my eating disorder, and It's just an unhealthy, thinking process. And I just kind of, I think there was a woman there that took a really, really beautiful interest in me, and we went on some retreat, and I think I relapsed into my disordered thinking and behavior patterns, and she tried to save me and help me, and again, when a person is there, if they're not ready to be helped, nothing you do is going to help them. I had to be ready for that. So my husband asked me to marry him. I knew I was going to have to become Catholic. And so even my dad even said, if you're going to marry Jacob, you have to become Catholic. And I said, I know, Daddy. And he said, if you can come to terms with that in your conscience, then I give you my blessing, because he's a fantastic man. And I said, I know, I know. And so we got married in my dad's church. It was an ecumenical ceremony. We had a dispensation from the bishop in Baton Rouge for Matter and Form because my dad was the pastor. And so we had the priest there, my dad there. My dad walked me down the aisle and then took his place, next to the priest, which is really beautiful because had I already become Catholic, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And so I wasn't Catholic yet, and so that we were able to have that kind of a ceremony. And so we went back to Alabama. My husband was in the military. He was in flight school, and so I went through RCIA. Now, by this point, I knew enough about Catholic theology that it could have probably been confirmed right then and there. But my priest, he was like, Allison, I know you know all this stuff, but I really think you should get this community aspect of it. And I was kind of mad at him, but I was like, okay, fine. So I went through the whole...
Because you were baptized.
Yes.
Twice.
So, second one stuck. No, I'm kidding.
In that sense, RCI isn't necessary, but the community part was, he was looking at you and said, I think you need a community.
Yeah, so I went, and there were a couple of people in that RCIA class with a similar background, so I was able to explain the Catholic faith in a way that they really understood because, I'd already struggled with those questions. But when they took out the rosary, I was really mad about that. I was like, we are all going to get struck down by lightning. Don't you understand what you're doing? And I was angry about that. So fast forward, it's the night, this is when The Runaway Bride, the movie, was popular. And so they nicknamed me the Runaway Catechumen. We're standing out by the Easter Vigil fire, and the priest goes, the Baptist church is right over there. You want to go? I'm like, it's all locked up, Father. Like, nobody goes on the night before Easter. Why go? So I came into the church at the Easter Vigil, and when the bishop asked me, do you believe everything the church teaches? About 1 million thoughts flooded my mind because the answer was no. I was only doing it out of obedience, out of submission to my husband and respect to him for our future children, because I'm a lot louder and more obnoxious about my faith than he is. And when we had kids, they would listen to me. And that's not the right order of things. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to go to church in separate places. So those were the reasons why I did it. And obedience to God and the scriptures, right? And his plan for the marriage and how a marriage and a family, the husband is the head of the household. And I wanted that. I wanted to do it God's way more than I wanted to do it my way. And when the bishop asked me that question, I'm like, what do I do? and I said the prayer, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief for the first time in my life. I've never said that prayer. I've always been able to prove to you why I was where I was. And so I said, God, if this is right, you're going to have to show it to me because I just don't see it. All of these people are telling me that all of these things are right, and this is the true faith, and this is the church that Jesus founded, and I don't see it. And so all of that in a split second went through my head. And so when I said yes, that was what was in my heart.
You didn't go...
I didn't. I didn't. And do you believe everything the church teaches? I do. Well, yeah, yes. So I, fast forward again. So as far as like coming into the full realization of where I was, that took a very, very long time. We started, the whole contraception issue, 1.5 years after we got married. I was scratching my head. I needed a new prescription. It's like, babe, I think I heard along the way somewhere that the church says that contraception is wrong. And he said, if you can prove to me that the church is wrong, then we'll still use contraception. I'm like, okay, cool. So I Googled how the pill worked. And for me, it was the abortifacient mechanism of contraception. And nobody had ever told me that it changes the lining of the uterus so that a fertilized egg might not implant. And for me, I'd always said, I believe life begins at conception. I knew enough about anatomy and physiology to know that there was a fertilized egg for several days before it reaches the uterus. And so I think C.S. Lewis said that only a risk tests the reality of a belief. And so I sat there with this crisis of faith, and I was like, surely that pill keeps me from ovulating every month, because that's one way it's supposed to work. But there's no way to know that without having an ultrasound every single month of my ovaries to see if there was an egg. And no insurance company is going to pay for that. And so I was like, well, I can't do that. I can't. And so my husband was sleeping because it was early in the morning, and I woke him up and I'm like, babe, we got to repent, like right now, get on our face and ask God to forgive us. And I bought a book called Taking Charge of Your Fertility. I did not know that there were people that could help me do that. I just thought I was, because I do. Once I find out that God is asking me to do something, I dive off. I mean, like head first. And so I taught myself how to use NFP with this book, and stopped taking the pill right then. And about 3 months later, on purpose. I know. I mean, I got pregnant. It was a choice that we made, and I knew that it was possible. And now we have a beautiful 16-year-old son named David, who is a joy, and has changed my life for all the good reasons. All of my children have made my life better in every way. And so that was, one thing, the whole contraception issue. But by the time I had 2 or 3 kids, I did not have any room in my brain anymore to carve out my position theologically. Like, I was just trying to keep, the dishes clean. And but when my second son was a year old, being a stay-at-home mom is very difficult. I don't know that anybody can quite prepare a woman for what it is like to become a mother. And that's part of my ministry, is just to help young mothers to know that this is normal. What you're feeling is normal, and just talk them through that. And so I think for my own mental health, I enrolled at Loyola University in New Orleans to get my master's degree in religious education. And so I started, this master's degree work at Loyola, and this is where I became fascinated with the history, like 2,000 years of Christian thought. I had never considered that before. And I was like, that's a long time. And then I know that history teaches us that hindsight is 20/20. We can always look back and know that the answers and the things that people did were wrong, because we're living in, the fruit of that. And so how could I ever look back and pass judgment on some, anybody, Christian or other, because I'm living my reality based on everything that they had done, everything, good and bad. And so that was a new thought for me. I read the Purpose of the Church in the Modern World, and I remember sitting at the library at Loyola just in shock, just thinking about scriptural exegesis and how we interpret the scriptures, and that all of us, not on purpose, but we come to the scripture from where we are in history. And really, is that interpretation the right one? And I thought, well, everybody thinks that their interpretation is the right one, and they truly believe that they are being led by the Holy Spirit, and can come to 2 very different conclusions about the scripture. So that was a new thought for me. So I finished my degree. We went to McAllen, Texas. My husband now works for U.S. Customs, and so we moved to McAllen, Texas. And the Hispanic community, Our Lady of Guadalupe, is a huge part of that culture. And so I started to lead a women's study, the Endow, educating on the nature and dignity of women. I was trained as a facilitator in that, and I led a group of women through that study. I thought, I have my own issues with Catholicism, so I can't really teach, because I don't want to scandalize anyone, right?
You're not quite there yet.
Right, no, I'm not quite there yet. But I am enough, so I would go sometimes to the Baptist church, and then we would go to Mass, and my oldest son remembers doing that. He was like, we were exhausted on Sundays, Mama. And so I led this group of women through St. John Paul's letter to women. And the way that the book was written was such a continuous thought that, with the complementarity of men and women, the Trinitarian image, and all of it just brought me through in such a way that I never really had any kind of disagreement with it. And then there was this chapter about Mary. And the way that it was logically laid out, it was just, oh, I understand now. And it was like the lights all just bling, and I was like, Mary, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Because I just kind of put her on a shelf, didn't want to think about her anymore. But the whole understanding of the purpose for masculinity, the purpose for femininity, God's plan for woman has everything to do with her. And not by any merit of her own, but just because of the plan of God from all eternity. And it just made so much sense to me. And I thought, okay, this is it. I'm a real bona fide Catholic now. And so I knew I had a master's degree in religious ed. I understood Mary. Purgatory was now that Mary's there, purgatory was not a hard one for me either. Sola Scriptura, that hadn't crumbled for me quite yet. Sola fide was never a part of my, because I always knew that it was more than just faith. Like I had to have that.
Lived out.
Yeah, I was always taught that. You know, the trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. I mean, that was a child's song, and I've always known that. So sola fide was never part of my imagination, but sola scriptura certainly was. But I had this whole desire to serve the Lord, just that fire that when I was preaching to the rocks, rose up within me again. And I was like, I can do this. And there was a position at the Diocese of Brownsville for the Office of Catechesis, the director of the Office of Catechesis. I was like, that's my job. But God was like, no, yeah, just wait. My daughter was only 2. It wasn't, I was like, okay, she's still kind of little. I can't put her in daycare. I know it's important for me to be home those 1,000 days, being with my kids. And so I waited. And then I met this woman. Her name is Laura. And she said, have you ever read Humanae Vitae? And I was like, no. She said, have you heard of the theology of the body? And I said, no. And she said, well, here's Humanae Vitae. Read that. And I, for the first time, felt the weight of the church's authority, like, boom, with the whole contraception, like every means of contraception, condoms, anything that a couple does to separate the procreative aspect from the unitive aspect, the church says is wrong. It was this big no. And I was so mad at Pope Paul VI. I said, how in the world does this celibate man have any understanding, any inkling of what he is telling women that we have to do? Like, this is crazy. And so then I read Theology of the Body. Now it was the Theology of the Body for Beginners. And somehow I had Kimberly Hahn's Life-Giving Love too. And so I read these in tandem with one another. And Christopher West, he's so great, but he's a guy. And sometimes that guyness, I was like, okay, I can't, give me the girl. And so then I had Kimberly, and I would be reading the emotion, the woman's voice. And then, women, sometimes we can be a little much too. So like, okay, all right, give me the guy. And so I did. I read it like that. And the church's teaching about God's plan for marriage, God's plan for marital love, God's idea for masculinity, femininity, the way they come together as a Trinitarian image. It was like I'd been putting a puzzle together my whole life, and this final piece put in, and I just got it. And I remember it was almost like a salvation experience for me. I felt like Mary Magdalene on the day of the resurrection. Nobody knows this. I mean, I know that other people do, but I felt like I was the only one, and I wanted to shake people awake. Be like, have you read the theology of the body? Do you understand that when we add in contraception to the man-woman relationship, it fundamentally changes the way that we interact with each other, especially on the most intimate levels. And so, my husband came home. He gets nervous when I read encyclicals because our life changes. And there were some things that we were doing that were immoral. And so I said, okay, we can't do these things anymore. And so in my mind, marriage was a big yes, right? So that intimacy, physical intimacy, is a no until you get married. And my expectation was that once I get married, I will never, ever, ever have to say no to this man ever again. The answer is yes, always. And after reading this, if a couple wants to avoid a pregnancy, the answer needs to be no for a while. And I really had a hard time with that. I was like, he waited for me for 2.5 years. He should not have to wait anymore. He shouldn't. And here I was, that means a baby. Women are only fertile for a little bit of their cycle, but I would have to say no. And so I struggled through those things. But really what it was God was working on my heart, because I had 2 boys, and then I had my daughter. I'm like, this baby making factory's closed. We're all done. I have goals and desires. I want a career. I want. And God said, what if I asked you to have another baby? And I was like, come again? Like, I have big plans, Lord. And he said, well, what if that's the big plan, Allison? What if I asked you to do that? Could you hear that? And I was like, well, no, because, Lord, having a baby means home. That means home. And I want to preach for you and teach for you. And he says, that's great. And I said, and people, they say they learn and they hear your voice through me. And he's like, thank you for that. What if I asked you not to? What if I wanted you to be silent and hidden for the rest of your life? And I was like, why would you give me these gifts if I was supposed to be silent? And he just was silent. And I said, I call it my Abraham moment. And I was like, okay, Lord, this gift, this desire, this whatever it is that you've put in me is my Isaac. And I'm going to put it on the altar for you. And either you're going to take it or you might give it back to me. I don't know what you're going to do with that. And I got pregnant right away. And so I knew that I'm like, God, I am going to be sad in a way for the rest of my life because I have given you something so, so precious to me. My dream, my desire, I said, and I know you can put me back together, but I'm going to be a really annoying daughter for the rest of my life. I just need you to know that. Well, I lost that baby at 17 weeks, my fourth child. And right as I had miscarried, all of my desires and dreams came true. I got a call from a school. I started teaching a school. I was the science teacher and I was the religion teacher. I got a call from New York City. I was going to go to New York City and be in a video about natural family planning. I got a call to go to Bulgaria. I went to Bulgaria to be a missionary and talk about sexual ethic and the God's plan for love and marriage to Muslim students in the Rhodope Mountains. I started going to the United Nations. All of these wildest, because New York was always part of my desire. That people, when I was in high school, they said, what do you want to do whenever you grow up? And I said, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's going to be in New York City. I'm going to be dressed very professionally, and I'm going to be in charge of it. And I remember when I was there for the first time, I walked up Fifth Avenue, and I was in my business suit, and I had my UN badge. And it dawned on me that it had come to pass. Yeah. And I was just, and in the middle of all of my wildest dreams coming true, I had other miscarriages. I was completely, so my husband and I went from using NFP with kind of a contraceptive mindset, like we're going to use this as Catholic birth control, to we went all the way to the other side, like we're just going to take all the babies, just bring us all the kids. That's kind of where we were looking at 15 passenger vans, just get ahead of the game, right? Like just go ahead and dive in. And God had other plans. And so I lost Jordan at 17 weeks and Jaden at about 16 or 15 weeks, and then Gabrielle at about 12 weeks. So within a period of 2 years, I had 3 miscarriages in the middle of doing all of these things. Because, and so when God gave it back to me, like he, with Isaac, right, he gave them the ram. So I knew that these things were from the Lord because I had fully submitted everything and he had given them all back to me. Now he continually asks me for that. And I'm like, this is your thing, God, whatever you want, it's yours, because he'll keep asking. And so, so that was a big, the theology of the body movement, to a different place of more full submission to the Lord. So
now this move as director, so does it move away from your UN work more to a local focus? Yeah,
so I was working for the St. Augustine Foundation for about 4 or 5 years. And that was in New York, and then the UN work is also in New York, but that's for Womb International. I'm a certified Billings ovulation method teacher. So I help couples who want to plan their families naturally using the Billings ovulation method. And so when I go to the UN, I'm there for Womb International, but then the work that I did in New York for the St. Augustine Foundation was a 13-week online course in chastity that I wrote. And it included charting for girls for their cycles. My desire for that was to lay a foundational learning for women so that they understood their bodies well enough that the move from fertility awareness to using it for family planning would be a very natural progression rather than, oh, by the way, here's this thing now that you're married. I felt like it was too late. It was just this gap that wasn't being filled. And so, but what happened was the foundation started to move in a little bit of a different direction with their funding and some, so the energies. And so that was in April of this year. And my priest, we got a new priest, Father Ruben, and he asked if I would help with the local church. And when I saw that the foundation was moving in a little bit of a different direction, I was like, you know what? Yes. And so I stepped away from that other position to be the director of catechesis and evangelization at our church. So,
I'd like to, well, there's a lot of things I'd love to talk about. We've got just 5 minutes left. But one of them is your Isaac moment, because it reminds me of a lot of folk that we deal with in the Coming Home Network who are Protestant ministers, let's say, and are drawn to the Catholic Church, but they're worried about losing their ministry.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to that Isaac moment, is saying, is this the church? And are you willing to let go of everything? Yeah. With the possibility of never even being in ministry again.
Yeah.
Are you willing to do that? But your witness is that the choice of accepting God's call in that Isaac moment is worth everything.
It is, absolutely. And I was willing to let it all go. And when I got pregnant, right away, I was like, okay, Lord, okay, I'm yours. And there was actually joy in the sorrow, knowing that I had done what God had asked me to do. And so I could find peace there.
Yeah. I was also thinking, and you're far more trained in the theology of the body than I am, but I look at the craziness of our culture right now in sexuality issues, marriage issues. I mean, just absolutely bizarre in my mind, where we've come in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Things are being accepted, promoted in our culture that our parents and grandparents never dreamed we get there. And I almost wondered if it's the devil's reaction to theology of the body.
Maybe so.
Here's John Paul, theology of body. We would never dream where we're at now, and then here we are in spades in the other direction.
Yeah, my husband says that here we are, we're three to four generations past the sexual revolution and the pill. There's no way that we could have had the sexual revolution without, birth control that was that worked. And he says that 3-4 generations in, we now have men who have never ever had to exercise self-control in that area, ever. Yep. The idea that our activity could lead to a child never crosses anybody's mind. And this is how you get a 15-year-old girl in a pregnancy center really believing she doesn't know how she got pregnant. And then we get all patronistic on her, right? Well, did you do the thing that you have to do to have, But what she's doing is simply operating in what our culture and society have told her. If you take this pill and you use this device, you won't get pregnant, or you won't get a sexually transmitted infection or whatever. And they believe that because that's what we've taught them.
Got an email, Cecilia from Michigan. Can Allison suggest some ways that we can better appreciate and understand the unique position women have within Catholic theology and tradition? What reading would you recommend to someone who wishes to learn more about the role of women within the Catholic Church? Does she have any favorite saints she thinks are a helpful inspiration for women today?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. The letter to women, Sister Prudence Allen was the one who wrote the commentary for that. So anybody that wants to get started, I would really recommend that study through Endow is, John Paul II's letter to women, and then Sister Prudence Allen's exposition of that. And as far as women's role, that's a cosmological kind of question. Women are the physical symbol of creation, of the church, she, bride, mother. So our role is very unique in that we symbolize the thing that we are. And so that was the beauty of the understanding of Mary, is that I symbolize the thing that I am. Mary is the ultimate symbol of that, but every single woman is that same image. And the really crazy thing is that men are also a creation. They're also called to be a part of the church. Not that men are women. Men are always and always forever men, but they are called to be part of that, the body of Christ. So I don't know if that answered her question or not. But
yeah. Well, in that Ephesians 5 passage, which was so important to you, understanding marriage, you talked about earlier, certainly there's the passage about a wife being submissive to her husband as a head. But the men's job is, men, you love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, in that passage, it's making the woman and the church one.
Yes.
The model of the church is the wife.
Yes.
And the wife and the church, that uniqueness. And as we as husbands look at the sacrifice of Christ for his
Right.
church, we are to do that for our
Yeah,
wives.
men are supposed to reveal and relive on earth the fatherhood of God. And to the degree that they love like Christ, that is where their power lies.
So, materdolorosa.net.
Yeah, that's our church website. And then all the courses that I wrote for the Sisterhood of Catholic Women and Adolescents, they're still online. And I share them with anybody. Yeah, so if anybody, it's free. I'm not trying to sell a curriculum or anything, so.
Well, thank you for everything.
Of course, yes.
For your
thank
story
you.
and for all the work you do in service to our Lord Jesus
Yeah.
Christ and His church.
Thank
you very
you.
much. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Allison's Journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.